Bailey wrote a number of books, 10 books in English, every one of which is very much worth reading. And most of them are written both for scholars and for lay people, for non-scholarly people. The one book that he wrote that was truly scholarly, and maybe slightly off-putting for some people, was his dissertation, which was published in 1976, Poet and Peasant. And it's in this book that Bailey really gives us the scholarly insights and background into his central ideas. So even though it might be off-putting for some people, it's essential reading if you're really going to understand the intellectual roots of what Bailey is trying to say through his message. Bailey was primarily interested in reinterpreting the parables of Jesus. And as I said, those parables were badly understood for 1,500 years or more in church history because people tended to see them as allegories. To some extent, we can blame this on Jesus himself, because at least in one good example, he treated his parable as though it were an allegory, and that's the parable of the sower, in which the sower is sowing seed on different kinds of ground, 4 different kinds of ground, and each different ground symbolizes a different kind of person who's receiving the message that the sower is sowing. And so Jesus, in effect, is giving us an allegory, much more so than a parable in that example. But this is atypical. This is not typical of what Jesus was doing in his parables. Usually the parables have one meaning, and they shouldn't be interpreted as allegories at all. The early church embraced this idea that not only the parables of Jesus, but all of Scripture should be interpreted allegorically, that there were in fact several different layers of understanding that we could gain or glean from Scripture, one of which is an allegorical understanding. The scholar who was most influential in this field was the 3rd century scholar from Alexandria, Egypt, Origen, who made a strong argument that all of Scripture must be understood allegorically. And that idea caught on in the church and continued until the Reformation. And it's really not until Martin Luther in the early 16th century that a serious scholar challenges this idea that allegory is the way that we should interpret Scripture. Luther insisted that the way to interpret Scripture was a literal interpretation. And what he meant by that is we should interpret it the way that the author meant it to be interpreted. If he's not giving us an allegory, we shouldn't be interpreting it allegorically. This made perfect sense to the humanists at the time. Luther generally tended to follow his own dictum, but from time to time, even Luther lapsed. He would read into Scripture occasionally his own favorite themes in theology, which is that we are saved by grace through faith and not by works. So even Luther occasionally lapsed from this idea that we need to be very strict in how we interpret Scripture. John Calvin was much better. He was much better at following Luther's essential dictum. But those scholars who followed Luther and Calvin, tended to fall back into the allegorical interpretation. And it's not until the late 19th century that scholars began to challenge that idea once again and to really rigorously attempt to understand the parables of Jesus from a literalistic perspective. And by the 1930s, you have C.H. Dodd embracing that idea and insisting that in order to understand the parables, we need to understand what he referred to as the Leben of Scripture, that is, the life setting of Scripture. And this would have, of course, warmed the heart of Ken Bailey, that the idea that we need to understand the cultural context in which the parables were spoken in order to really understand them. But here's the problem with Dodd, and that is that for him the Leben was actually the early church and not the life of Jesus himself. His argument was that the early church had inherited the parables of Jesus, and they had reformulated them and revised them and edited them in such a way as to speak to the issues that they were concerned with. So that the Litz and Laban of the parables of Jesus, as we've inherited them in the scriptures, is not the life of Jesus, but it's the time of the early church, the first and second century following Jesus. Bailey and other scholars would object to that. They would insist that the Litz and Laban of the parables of Jesus is actually the life of Jesus himself, that the parables of Jesus really are the parables of Jesus, to use N.T. Wright's expression. Scholars were taking that approach, at least by the 1940s, where Bailey picks up on this idea and moves it a step further, is that scholars were really incapable of doing what they truly wanted to do, which is to reinterpret Jesus according to his own life setting, because they didn't really have a strong grasp of the cultural milieu in which Jesus was operating. And so Ken Bailey's contribution was to discover that cultural setting for his generation. He did this by being a missionary in Upper Egypt between 1955 and 1965, in which he served in small villages, small traditional villages. And what he discovered was that these traditional villages of Upper Egypt, in which there's no electricity, no plumbing, in which people are largely illiterate. In fact, he was there teaching literacy. What he discovered was that their culture had changed very little from the culture that Jesus had experienced nearly 2,000 years before. So that by understanding the culture of Upper Egypt, he was getting insights into the general peasant culture of first century Israel, because it is essentially the same culture. And so by immersing himself into that, he was then able to take the knowledge that he had gleaned from that environment of Upper Egypt and apply it to his understanding of Jesus' parables. So his first great book was the Cross and the Prodigal, which he wrote in 1965, 1966, and it wasn't published until 1973. And it's a retelling of the story or the parable of the prodigal son, but from the perspective of a Middle Easterner. Bailey had gone to a variety of villages, and he had preached sermons on what he understood to be the true message that Jesus was conveying, and he tested his ideas against the peasants to whom he was preaching, and asked them, if these things had happened in the time of your grandfather, what would have been their reaction? And so he tested his ideas, and so the end result of this book was that he had produced an interpretation of the parable of the prodigal son as it would have been understood by a first century peasant.